Okay, last video in this chapter, we're going to talk about how how there are some reactions to some of the negative working conditions, some early efforts at reform, and also just how the working conditions in the Industrial Revolution are differing from those in the cottage industry and in the agricultural sector before that. So at first, you're going to see that some people are reluctant to transition from the cottage industry to factory work, largely because they have less control over the situation that they're working in. In the cottage industry, of course, you're working in your own home, right? You can basically plan your schedule so that you are taking whatever product the merchant sent to you, working really, really hard for 4 days, sending in that product, getting paid, and then taking a few days off. You can totally do that, right? Whereas in the factory, you ultimately are working under somebody else's watch and you have very little control over how many breaks you can take, um, any other type of condition, how much light you have, what temperature it is in the room, anything like that. So there are a lot of people who don't like kind of the in their minds, they actually believed that the early factories resembled poorhouses, which are more or less prisons, places for people who are incredibly poor, who can't afford anything. Um, it's just basically an opportunity to keep them occupied, keep them busy, keep them off the streets. So because the early factories resembled poorhouses, there were a lot of people that did not want to voluntarily work in them. That's another reason why you have a pretty significant early trend towards child labor, because so few people actually wanted to work in factories. You had people who had absolutely no control work in factories instead, just basically force people into it. Also, this work was sort of impersonal in nature. Um, Under the cottage industry, you tended to be maybe a little bit more skilled in the type of labor you were doing. You were you were taking something from a raw material and taking it all the way to a finished product. Like of course with the textile industry, you were getting wool, for example, spinning it into yarn, turning it into whatever type of clothing. I mean, every member of your family might have been a different part of that process. Some people are spinning threads, some people are weaving it into the final product, whereas you were less skilled, probably working completely on your own, less opportunity to sort of work in a unit in factories. So a lot of people did not like that impersonal nature. At first, even in the factories, there was an inclination to work as a whole family unit, partly because people were used to that in the cottage industry. It was sort of a family enterprise. Everybody was working on a different part of the final product. Um, so at first, you're going to see that the early people transitioning into the factories are going to be working as a whole family, and that shows us that at first there isn't really an emphasis on reforming child labor because parents actually wanted their kids to work with them. But this also means, of course, that if parents and children are working together, they have more of an opportunity to actually see what their kids are doing, and one can assume that their kids are not going to be subject to really harsh working conditions if they are working side by side with their parents. Um, but in situations where work was very poor for children, you are going to see some early efforts to have reform against child labor. So one person in particular, Robert Owen, who owns several factories of his own, is going to deliver testimony before Parliament in England against child labor. And he tries to set a standard that he wants other people to follow, and he raises the minimum age to work in his factory to 12. And his idea is to try to encourage factory owners across the board to also follow this standard. We're going to talk about Owen in a second as well, because he's sort of this utopian industrialist. So maybe his attempt to reform child labor here is another example of him trying to be idealist in nature. You're also going to see early investigation efforts um, to sort of see what the conditions of child labor are in various factories. And so Parliament is going to establish the Sadler Commission, which is an investigative commission that basically looks into working conditions in factories and also figure out what kind of legislation needs to be initiated to improve conditions in factories. So that's the Sadler Commission, basically just this investigatory organization to try to see what is bad about working conditions and what kind of laws can we pass to improve that. The first actual law that we see resulting from the Sadler Commission is the Factory Act. This is passed in 1833, and really it's not that dramatic of a piece of legislation. Um, it introduces an 8-hour workday for children aged 9 to 13, and a 12-hour workday for kids ages 14 to 18. So you might say, well, wait, there you can still work. Um, if you are a child, yes. So basically, it's not eliminating child labor whatsoever. It's just trying to keep them from working those 14 to 16-hour workdays. Where it does have more of an impact is for children under the age of 9. They no longer can work in factories. Instead, they are required to go to schools that factory owners were required to establish. So this is a huge change, right? So basically now factory owners have to set up these schools for children under the age of 9. And this is one of the reasons why, in a lot of ways, early efforts at education were kind of meant as an alternative to factory work. They were meant as a way to keep children busy. Um, Now, this ironically kind of breaks up the earlier pattern of families working as whole units in factories. So, you know, that was one circumstance where sometimes parents didn't necessarily mind their children going to work with them. Because of the Factory Act, you're going to see less of a likelihood that children and parents are going to be working together. But still, nonetheless, the Factory Act is not eliminating child welfare, it's just placing caps on how many hours the kids can work. You are still going to see family members work together in many circumstances. You're still going to see families subcontract work out to relatives. Also, you're going to see that when new people move into a city, oftentimes they get their job because of some sort of family connection. They also may settle in neighborhoods that are sort of ethnically homogenous, and they can kind of get help from their neighbors for getting jobs. So, in other words, if you're moving to England from Ireland in search of work, you're going to move into a predominantly Irish neighborhood and talk to your neighbors, and one of them will likely help you find a job. Urbanization is another huge effect of the Industrial Revolution. It's historically the largest population transfer in human history. So basically, people moving from rural agricultural areas to factory towns. Cities are going to grow into huge industrial centers. A huge example of that is Manchester, England. We're going to see a DBQ on Manchester at the end of this chapter. So Manchester was virtually non-existent prior to the Industrial Revolution, and it is a humongous industrial center afterwards. You're also going to see the whole purpose of cities is going to change. Cities used to be more governmental centers, but now they're going to be and cultural centers. But now you're going to see that they are centers of industry. That they are places where things are made and traded and exported, rather than centers of governance or centers of culture. Um, Now you're going to see that living conditions aren't necessarily worse off than they were in agricultural areas, but they seem to be worse, partly because the conditions of living are so cramped in the cities. Sexual division of labor. Like I was saying earlier, you're going to see women are going to experience less opportunities after the Industrial Revolution than they did prior. Again, unlike the cottage industry, you're going to see less of an emphasis on families as one entire economic unit. So families are going to be less closely bound together than they were during the cottage industry. You're going to take productive work out of the home. Now things are produced in a factory, not in the home, so there's less of an emphasis on women's role in producing things. Um, you're going to see man emerging as the primary wage earner, that is. Women, especially in the middle class, are going to find less economic opportunities. All right, so in the middle class, at least, there's going to be this doctrine that emerges called separate spheres, right? The idea that men are supposed to occupy the public realm, the men are supposed to be in the work sphere in public, and women are supposed to be in the private sphere at home. Um, so again, this really only applies to the middle class because if you are poor, you need to continue to work. So poorest women and unmarried women are still going to work outside the home, but you're going to see that in conditions where women did work, it commanded very low wages and they were still very much exploited. Um, you're going to see that women have difficulty working in these new factory conditions because they have a harder time accommodating to the rigid schedules of factory life when they're trying to take care of a family. Um, you're going to see that some factories are attempting to have a more rigid sexual division of labor because they don't want there to be excessive fraternization between men and women at work because that can result in less production and of course unwanted pregnancies. So sometimes this attempt was very deliberate. You're also going to see, just like with child labor attempts, or attempts to reform child labor, you're going to see an attempt to keep women out of work in the mines, in particular with the Mine Act of 1842. This is going to keep women and girls from working in mines, but it's also going to keep boys from under 10 from working in mines. Um, and again, some of this is to guarantee that sexual division of labor. And this is going to be met with a lot of resistance because mining was a pretty high paying job at the time. Okay, so the early labor movement in Britain, you're going to see again, there's going to be this growth of class consciousness and resentment among the working class towards factory owners. All right, because again, they're going to see that they are exploited so that the middle class can make as much money as possible. You're also going to see in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, workers are going to do certain things to try to protect their position uh, uh, at work. So many of them are going to try to unionize and establish strikes. But in 1799, Parliament is going to pass the Combination Acts that actually outlaw striking and the formation of unions. So any early attempts to sort of organize against exploitation are going to there's going to be an attempt by Parliament to stop this by 1799. Um, but at the same time, you're going to see that the combination acts are generally ignored by workers and they're going to be repealed by 1824. All right, also, you're going to see some people, Robert Owen in particular, the same guy who tried to minimize child labor, he's going to attempt to establish a national union throughout England in 1834, but this is going to fail, and instead you're going to see individual craft unions continue. So craft unions are much more conservative than what a national union would have done, but at the same time, they're still going to win benefits for their members. So still, you're going to see some attempt at kind of resisting the exploited position that laborers could find themselves in. And lastly, we're going to see, just in general, analyzing the Industrial Revolution. Was it good or was it bad, depending on what social class you were in? Well, many historians argue that overall it was a good thing, right? First off, with the advent of the steam engine, the locomotive, railroads, you're going to see that there are many more sources of power, transportation, to replace back-breaking human labor. So even if you're still working in factories, likely your condition is a little bit less severe than it could have been prior to the steam engine and the transportation revolution. You're also going to see that in general there's more money available to spend. Okay, so more wealth available means more human consumption. People are actually out buying more things. The economy is improving in that aspect. Um, in general, more food and clothing is produced, so people are going to be um, able to actually, again, wear more cotton clothing items. They're eating better, they are eating more diverse amounts of food, so this is also going to make the population rise. luxury items are going to be more commonplace. People are going to have more leisure time, but at the same time, the huge element of criticism is from socialists and communists. They argue that even though there are all these good things up here, that these are things that only the middle class is benefiting from. So of course we're going to talk about this a lot more in class, but these videos just give you a little bit of an overview of chapter 22 in McKay to get us going.